co-founders of OfficeHours. Been doing this now for a couple of years. Used to be with Battery Ventures, started OfficeHours a couple of years ago. And the whole concept ends up being really a lot of preparation for the buy side. So recruiting prep, behaviorals, technicals, modeling, deal walkthroughs, all really basically summarized into coaching ends up being our main focus, whether it be for hedge funds, growth equity, private equity, corp dev, what have you. And then, of course, we interact with many coaches, Alice being one of them. And actually, we love HBS, love growth equity as a whole. So we'd love to turn it over to you to get a better understanding of your background. And then, of course, we can dive right into it.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Alice, originally from the suburbs of Detroit. Grew up in Michigan most of my life, attended University of Michigan for undergrad, where I studied business, focused on finance and accounting. And my first job out of school was in investment banking. So I was working in San Francisco in a tech group at Lazard. So I spent 3 years there working as a banking analyst and then an associate during my third year, and then decided to make the move over to growth equity. So I was working at Technology Crossover Ventures on the consumer internet team, spent a lot of my time focused on digital health as well as other verticals as well, including e-commerce and some travel. I think, post my time there, realized that I wanted to transition out of a finance role and do something a little bit more operational and entrepreneurial. Felt like a better fit with kind of my interests and skill sets, and was also applying to business school at the time. So ended up going to HBS and kind of used that as a transition point for myself. Really loved my experience, just graduated last May. I met my co-founder my first year in business school, and we really bonded over a lot of shared passion and interest over the chronic health space and women's health, and ended up starting a company together focused on helping women with hormonal chronic conditions. And so now I'm full-time working on the startup, and I'm based in Boston today.
Love it. Love it. That's awesome. And one, appreciate the time for you doing this. What I would say is, and correct me if I'm wrong, I feel like on the entrepreneurial side of things, and of course, I was technically employee number 2 before, but now like starting your own thing, fires and effectively like doing anything in the moment really ends up taking a lot of priority, simply put, right? And sometimes it's like, hey, look, like little things that may not have bothered you when you're technically on like a W-2 role, all of a sudden now you're responsible for. So really appreciate it, because I feel like half the time we generally get caught up on the startup side of things. We don't really think too much like, hey, look, like I know I'm like doing this, which honestly really benefits us and our community, but it's like I've got like 100 other things that I need to worry about to see if this like rocket ship like takes off type of situation in the form of a startup. How has been that transition, I guess, is like the first question, from finance where, and I had like a VP breathing down my throat, which I think is like very different. It's like breathing down your own throat, to learn more on your end.
Yeah, I think it's incredibly different. I would say there's a lot of transferable skills that you can have from finance into entrepreneurship, but I would say the day-to-day looks so different. I think my experience in finance was way more structured. You're working with a team. It's pretty hierarchical sometimes, and you're reporting to people and there's different expectations. And I thought it was such a great learning experience. And I got a lot of like repetition of seeing different companies and understanding how they work and getting the lay of the land and seeing different business models. But I think on the startup side, it is much more chaotic, but also that's kind of the beauty of it, which is you get to really run with it and create something and build something from scratch. I think for me, that's kind of what I love about it, though. I feel like I'm always wearing different hats, figuring things out. Even when I don't know how to do something, I think figuring out where the resources or people that I can talk to get those questions answered. I tend to think of myself as a pretty organized person. So in some ways, it's kind of trying to create organization within the chaos. I would say the day-to-day is very different. I live by like to-do lists and like roadmaps and things like that. And so I think the most helpful thing for me has been taking like a broader goal and breaking it down into bite-sized milestones that we can kind of like achieve on a day-to-day basis or on like a 2-week sprint or something. So very different, but it's definitely exciting and keeps us on our toes.
Love it. Yeah, I think organized chaos honestly ends up being like a really good way to describe it. And I feel like part of it is a bit more on like the sales and customer success side, and I always kind of have been. The calendar is generally something that we kind of like live and abide by. Otherwise, you just get pulled in too many directions. And I would argue just being in finance and having that background definitely helps you when it comes to that forced organization. And then, of course, being able to move forward, being like, okay, so before it was calendar management, email management, inbox zero, whatever it is. And now it's like, okay, at least those are kind of like, hopefully intrinsically kind of like built in within the system where you can actually go about being like, okay, now it's like me setting my own artificial deadlines. And without those, I mean, what good are we to a certain degree?
Yeah, no, totally. I think that's a really good point. I think my experience both in banking and growth equity did set myself up for success in some of those areas. I think even when I'm thinking about my experience juggling multiple deals on the banking or growth equity side, really having to be super organized about like, how do I prioritize which deal is going to take the most of my attention for today, or like what are the top to-do lists for, everything that I'm working on. And then I think even when I was doing growth equity and kind of some of the sourcing initiatives that we were doing, being super, super organized about like who we were reaching out to, when was the last touch point that we had, when did we call them, what was discussed during those calls, and when do we need to reach back out. I think that was really, really helpful practice as well for as we are like having conversations with customers, investors, and being able to stay super organized on top of that as well.
Awesome. No, appreciate that. So because our, call it like customer base and mentee base generally ends up spanning quite a few different individuals, we have maybe like almost like 50,000 individuals on the newsletter, but this ranges from individuals that are breaking into, call it like college, thinking about banking, breaking into banking, summer internship, all the way up to, of course, kind of like that analyst to associate transition, senior associates, VPs and beyond. If we take it a step back, so Michigan, and then of course, thinking through finance as a whole, and I know this is a while ago, thinking through the summer analyst internship, and then of course, leveling up to literally an elite boutique, right? I think definitely like that, it was HL, if I'm not mistaken, before that.
Right.
Both phenomenal platforms, both phenomenal brand names, but of course, Lazard ends up being kind of like creme de la creme, to be fair. And of course, at the end of the day, the associate jump / promotion is not easy to get. So did you know you wanted to get into banking from the onset? And what did that process look like?
Honestly, I didn't. It's crazy that I was talking to someone the other day about the summer analyst recruiting process and how early it's getting pushed out and how intense some of the resumes that are coming through are. And honestly, if I was applying today, there's probably no way I would be in investment banking at the moment. So props to everyone who is going through that process. I didn't know. And I think I really went through this super long journey of figuring out what I wanted to do and ruling out all the different possibilities. I think what I did know is, at least in high school, I really loved my math and science classes. So I knew that I was generally pretty analytical and numbers oriented. And so I wanted to do something that incorporated that element, but I also loved working with people and being collaborative and being on a team. I think I came across investment banking through a couple like discovery programs that they have for like freshmen and sophomore during our college years. And so I thought that was a really great way of just getting to know what does the industry do, what does it entail. And I really loved the nature of being able to blend kind of both of those things that I was looking for, but also that it's a very fast-paced environment. It felt like a really great foundation or learning experience as someone straight out of school. And so by my junior year, that's when I started recruiting for investment banking roles. And I'm happy to go into more detail about my specific train of thought if it's helpful or at a later time. But I think I knew I wanted to do finance and kind of rolled out all the other segments before I landed on investment banking.
Was the consulting part of it in theory?
In theory, it was. And I think to your point about prioritization, I think there's just so many different things that can kind of like pull at your attention. And consulting was definitely very interesting to me. But I think in the end, I just ultimately kind of committed to investment banking as being kind of the platform that I wanted to spend most of my time. And that's kind of the route that I went down. So a combination of chance, but also, it fulfilled a lot of the criteria that I was looking for in a first-time job.
Cool. That makes sense. What did the transition look like, if you don't mind me asking, when it came to the summer analyst role, leveling up to full time? Because honestly, it's been tough, right? Like we started the business in the middle of a pandemic where arguably we had a lot of layoffs. You had people we had individuals that had roles set up at MS that didn't technically basically their offer letters got pulled. And then they had to go we had individuals working retail. During COVID in the beginning, nothing was open other than retail. To be fair, that was barely open too. So it's like, look, I've got these bills. I've got student loans that I got to pay off. And to be fair, I'm going to try to do what I can to break back in, but I need some day-to-day money. So they went back to retail, and then we helped them break back into banking at a different role. So that happened. Then all of a sudden, post-COVID, in the middle of the end, there was a big boom of hiring as a whole. You as an analyst could got literally 2-3 offers before the end of the day. That's how crazy it was. We were like, oh my God, we're inundated. The world is opening back up. We need a lot more people. And now we're back to a lot of summers aren't converting to full-time, and very few are. And then to be fair, sure, there's the private private equity side of things for recruiting later. But the reality is that banking's been honestly now gotten back to the point of like, hey, like, sure, I got a summer, but getting full-time is difficult. So what did that look like coming from summer to full-time, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, I mean, I personally loved my experience at Houlihan Lokey. I really loved the team. I loved what I was doing. I was on the media and technology group, so really fit a lot of the interest areas that I had when it came to an industry coverage group. I was fortunate to get a return offer at the end of my summer. What was funny was I actually had this associate who was a mentor of mine actually kind of like pull me aside at the end of the day and was like, it's really great that you got this offer, but I would actually encourage you to think about what other opportunities are out there. And for you as someone who, didn't go to school in LA, doesn't have family in LA, you don't have that like personal tie. Is this necessarily where you want to start your career? And I think that was an interesting piece of advice because I think usually people are trying to keep their summer analysts and convert them. But I think he really had my best interest at heart. I would say the landscape has changed a little bit over time as well. I think when I was interning, 5 to 10 years ago, it was still much more focused on like media, entertainment dominant industries. And now there is much more business and startup and entrepreneurship and things like that. But I think it made a lot of sense as someone straight out of college. Was Los Angeles the best place to start my career versus a place like a New York or San Francisco, where there is much more of a business focus. So after my internship ended, I started putting out feelers to different banks at other places. I would say the recruiting process is much less structured because the spots are pretty limited and usually filled with people who came in from that internship cohort. So I think I really tapped into my network, try to figure out where did my friends intern, were their banks hiring, did they know people on the inside that they could connect me to and talk to? If not, I was cold reaching out to HR contacts at the different banks that I wanted to interview with and just ask them kind of what their process was and whether they had any openings. And I think it was through sort of like networking and getting to know people and getting a pulse check on what the openings look like that I was able to kind of break in and go through a couple interview processes full-time for that role. And so in the end, I had a couple different options, but Lazard felt like it was the best fit from both, what is the best place to start my career, but also where did my interest lie in terms of like industry coverage groups and things like that.
Sorry, did that end up being tech?
Yes, I was in the tech group at Lazard.
That's awesome. Because that's definitely, at the end of the day, of course, a top group overall, especially being able to work out of a New York office. Did you think about when you were joining, staying on as an associate, and any advice you would give to juniors as they kind of think about that too?
I would say stay open-minded. I definitely did not foresee myself staying past an analyst in investment banking. I think I kind of assumed I would sort of follow the pack and either go off and work for a tech company or potentially recruit for the buy side, which honestly, that actually wasn't even really on my radar until much later. So I think that people who know what they want and are ahead of the game, like really, really good for you. But if you feel like you don't know what it is that you want to do after your banking experience, I would say like don't worry or stress about it too much because you can definitely figure it out over time. And it took me a while as well. I think the transition to the associate role was one that the team presented to me in my second year. And honestly, it wasn't something I thought about before. But I think as I was talking to different people and thinking through it more and more, it actually made a lot of sense to me. I did love my team, which I know not everyone says about their investment banking experience. And obviously there's highs and lows, but for the most part, I really, really liked the people that I worked with. I felt like I got really good deal experience and worked with some really cool clients. One of my favorite was I worked on the Google HTC acquisition, got to fly out to Taiwan with my director. And so that was like such an amazing experience for me as an analyst. And I think when I took a step back and looked at the associate role, I felt like there was still opportunity for me to grow. I felt like there was still a lot I could learn about the tech industry. I felt like there was a way to sort of level up the type of work that I was doing. And instead of just fully executing or building PowerPoint decks and changing numbers and models, that I had an opportunity to think a little bit more high level and strategically about, the initiatives that we were putting together. And then also being able to manage people. So manage analysts below me was also a skill set that felt like worth developing. And so when I thought about all of those things, it actually made a lot of sense for me to stay on. And I ultimately did it. And I think it was a great decision for me.
Nice. No, that's hugely helpful. because on cycle for actually 2025, if we're in 2023, and I have to go back and like think about the years, because literally 2 years out, individuals have already recruited, like a lot of individuals. And technically like the bigger firms went maybe like a month ago at this point. It was literally during July, and which is arguably, it used to be before training finished. This was like before training started, if that makes any sense. So a lot of individuals will be very, very caught up. Like we do like a lot of polling and surveying. A lot of individuals are like, oh, like waiting it out, trying to figure out what this is. So to the point that you brought up, right? Like, I feel like it's phenomenal to have an understanding of like what you want to do. But to be fair, does anyone really know what they want to do in their 20s?
Not at all. I mean, I feel like I still don't know what I want to do sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Did you know you wanted to start something? And I mean, there's just so many like angles we can take this question, but did you know you wanted to start something? Because I feel like in my mind, I knew I wanted to start something. I didn't really know what. It was a Sif's idea, actually, co-founder wise. So mine was more like, hey, let's just focus on execution. But I feel like sometimes it's literally just like, okay, as cards are dealt, pursue those opportunities. Because you can have like, I don't know if you remember like Carlton and Fresh Prince, like way back in the day, like the show, he literally had a life plan. He's like, hey, like Princeton fits in right here. But the reality is like, no one can really abide by a life plan like that. Sure, you can have this idea, but if something goes like totally awry, like what happens? Like, do you just like stop? You can't do that, right? Just keep moving in the different ways that I feel like life hits you. But yeah, I mean, it's awesome to hear the associate side of things, right? Like staying on as an associate, still recruiting. And I think we can hone focus on that for a second, because a lot of individuals think like, if I stay on as an associate, it's literally me telling the world that I want to stay in banking. So it's very difficult to recruit. So what did that look like for the associates that are listening in?
I don't know if I fully buy that, honestly. I think, sure, if you get to like a second or third year associate or a first year or second year VP, like, you know, if you're in it that long at that point, maybe that can send a signal. But I would say even then, I've seen people transition over. It's definitely doable. It's probably less common, but it's not impossible. I think, especially when you're first year or even into your second year as an associate, you're still, I mean, you're not that. I think sometimes people are worried that you're untrainable or you can't kind of, you know, transition over to a slightly different way of thinking through the investor lens versus through a banker lens. But I think if you have that like 1 or 2 extra years, that's not really going to make a difference. I think if anything, that actually helped me. I think it gave me an extra year of just really better understanding like how to connect the dots of what I'm doing in investment banking. I feel like my first year of banking, I had no idea. I was kind of going through the motions, like putting things on decks, changing numbers in cells and the models, but like, could I tell you high level, like what this deal meant, or like what was the strategy behind it, or really understanding all the different moving pieces? Like I probably couldn't have articulated it super well. And I feel like that extra year actually helped me better understand those things, especially looking at everything through an associate's lens, where you are kind of pushed to think a little bit more high level, more strategically. And I also think that when I was recruiting, I think people actually liked that I had 1 extra year working experience, because it kind of signaled to them that I could actually hit the ground running a little bit. I had more perspective and more experience with the tech industry that I was covering. And so I didn't feel like it hurt me at all. If anything, I think it kind of helped me, or felt like I was able to be more prepared and talk through my experience in a more clear way.
Yep, that's awesome. No, in all honesty, how we view it is that like if you're recruiting as an associate, arguably, technically for the private equity firm, you're coming in at a discount, right? If you're hiring an analyst 2 years out who in theory think that they want to do something, but in comparison, you're hiring someone that actually knows what they want to do, arguably that person that really knows what they want to do will look to stay there longer, right? Considering they actually have the experience of thinking through like, hey, look, like I've done banking now. I know what I like about it. I know what I don't like about it. I know I want to double down on tech and software. So that's what I'm really interested in, versus the individual that's just like, hey, look, like come into this room, we're KKR, interview with us. You may or may not like banking, but to be fair, we haven't given you a chance to even like think through that yet, which I think that's like peeves around like the on-cycle process. But to be fair, it is what it is. How did you not only like think about it, but keep up with the maybe analysts that were going through on-cycle when you were recruiting, or when you were thinking like, hey, look, like I know I'm like thinking about this a little bit differently. I'm going to give my fair shot here. I'm going to recruit later. Like, how do you kind of keep your cool during some of that stuff?
Yeah, no, that's a really great question. I think there is a lot of pressure to follow the pack and kind of do what everyone else is doing. And, you know, I'll be completely honest. Even though I didn't know what I wanted to do, I still kind of went through the motions of it. You know, I wanted to get a feel of if it was right for me. So even for some of the on-site on-cycle recruiting processes. I did talk to some people. I did go to some of their like networking events. I think I kind of dipped my toe into
before you initially recruited.
Before I recruited, exactly. And I think it was just more for me to understand, like, especially when I'm a first year in banking and have no idea what's going on, like being able to go to some of these events and talk to headhunters and talk to people, it gave me a sense of like, okay, what is growth equity? Like people love to talk about growth equity, but even within growth equity, there's so many different strategies and, it's not like one single, very straightforward definition. So I think kind of going out, putting out feelers was really helpful for me to just better understand, what does this recruiting process look like? What kinds of questions are they asking? What are they looking for? I didn't end up going through like a full like on-cycle process ultimately, but I think, still kind of going out and checking out
the waters a little bit.
I'm sorry?
Testing the waters a little bit.
Yeah, definitely. And then I think for me, it just felt like this wasn't necessarily the process. And so I think kind of just like listening to myself and feeling like I don't have to be doing what everyone else was doing. And then I think also going back to your previous question, the extra year also helped because it kind of gave me a sense of, is this something that I want to do or not? When I was in banking and a lot of my peers were going off to the buy side or going off into tech, it gave me the opportunity to pick the brains of some of my peers who like went off and were doing these different things and gave me a better sense of like, what does their day-to-day life look like? And are they actually enjoying what they're doing in investing? Or are they enjoying what they're doing in tech? And I thought I was actually going to finish out my banking experience and go off into a tech or an industry role. And I think it was talking to different people and getting a better pulse check of what their day-to-day looked like that actually changed my mind and made me want to recruit for buy side as opposed to like tech right away. And so, yeah, again, I think that was another advantage of waiting it out was I was able to hear from other people's personal experiences too.
Huge. That's awesome. OfficeHours didn't exist at the time, but we'll learn a little bit more around individuals that helped you, whether it be, and tell me, right? Did individuals help out? Was it like online resources? How did you prepare? How did you think about TCV initially? And I sent out a webinar email yesterday. I mean, TCV, I remember that $4 billion fund that a couple of our buddies used to be involved with. And then of course, now what it looks like a couple of years later, but like phenomenal, very, very prominent consumer names, kind of like the Netflixes, the Metas of the world. I think even like Avalero's on that list, which is a similar company to what Battery invested into. But would love to get a better understanding. How did you think about TCV? Do you know much about it? I mean, excuse me, I assume you did from Lazard days, to be fair. But in general, what that process looked like, what made you choose them? And then, of course, maybe we dive a little bit into the interview process too.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in terms of how I thought about TCV, this would be different than how I would phrase it in an interview, but I would say my recommendation for everyone is if you're not one of those people who kind of come in knowing this is exactly what I want to do, I think it's helpful to keep an open mind and in some ways cast a wide net. I think for me, in an ideal world, I would have done growth equity and was fortunate for me that it did pan out. And I think as I was thinking about the different stages of buy side, I think growth equity kind of fit my experience, but also what I was looking to do the most. I think when I was thinking about private equity, it's a lot of financial modeling. You're really working with numbers all the time. You're working with much later stage companies. And that didn't excite me as much as those that were in a growth stage or more like startup focused companies. I think on the VC side, a lot of firms, from my understanding, was they were still pretty sourcing focused. And I also still wanted something that was like rooted in the numbers and the analyses. And so growth equity felt like a good sweet spot kind of in between. And then I talked to headhunters. And so I would say, opportunities that sort of came up, I would talk to them, even if it didn't really fit necessarily that profile. I did talk to some middle market, like PE companies. I did talk to some VCs. And I think growth equity also a lot of times, like even that as a category, the different firms within it can it's sort of a sliding scale. Some feel a little bit more venture-y, some feel a little bit more like a buyout firm. So that's why I think I was keeping myself pretty open-minded. Again, in an ideal world, I would have worked on consumer tech companies. I love like the consumer facing side. And when the opportunity with TCV came up, it kind of fit a lot of those different criteria. And then started having conversations with the team, really liked where the conversations went. And I think kind of opportunistically had the offer. And that was kind of the first offer I took. And it really fit those areas. So
I love it. Sorry, I think the scale is like a really, really big part about growth equity. You'll have like a couple $100 million growth equity firms, and there's nothing against like one way or the other, right? It's like what's a fit for you. But if you have like a couple $100 million like growth equity firm, but then at the same time you have growth equity firms like a TA, like a TCV, like a Summit that would arguably put literally $100 million plus to work in a single deal. So it's kind of like, what are we thinking about here, right? When it comes to a scale perspective, and from what perspective, I would argue. I think TCV is phenomenal in the capacity, similar to the likes of kind of like a TA Summit, correct me if I'm wrong, but at the end of the day, you have these firms that are rather scaled out. And to be fair, they have almost like private equity money to play with, to deploy. So if it comes down to like a bigger round that they're looking to get involved in, or really make like an impactful kind of like difference on the growth equity side of things when it comes to a specific company. What were your thoughts on that? And then of course, I'm sure you were dealing with like larger companies, to be fair, of scale as a whole at Lazard as well, right?
Yeah, so TCV Strategy is really interesting. TCV stands for Technology Crossover Ventures. So even within the name crossover piece is like it invests in private companies and it has the ability to invest in public companies as well. And I would say actually, at least when I was there, and the strategy might have changed, but I think we really did look at things across the board. So I was even talking to companies as early as in like their Series B, all the way up into like companies that had like IPO'd. And so it was really cool to kind of like see that range. And then to your point about scale, I think the scale part was definitely something that was very attractive to me. And some of the names that you threw out there, at least on the consumer side, lots of really, really great brand names as well. Airbnb, Spotify, Netflix, and, you know, even the investment with Netflix, it was from the very beginning before it was like the success story that it is today. And now it's a public company. And so I think that definitely helped a lot in terms of as an associate on the team, when you're trying to break into companies, really connect to different CEOs and have those initial sourcing conversations. It helps that it has a really, really strong track record. And I would say, you know, when it comes to the scale too, a lot of our partners had really, really amazing experience. And that definitely helped as well in being able to kind of showcase their track record and be able to talk about the types of companies that they've invested in. So I would say the scale piece and the brand name was definitely huge highlights for me. And I think it was really, really interesting to kind of see how that all played out.
Awesome. I'm going to open it up for questions, kind of side note. Really interesting stuff overall. I think, and we will come back to this as a whole, because I've got this like kind of like crazy analogy when it comes to thinking through like, okay, if you have basically like a control tower, an airport, and pretend instead of the planes, let's discuss like rocket ships for a second, only because of like the Elon Musk angle. You've got consultants sitting above the control tower, maybe at like 10,000 feet. You've got bankers at roughly 5,000 feet, and basically they're parachuting into the control tower when they need to. Then you have investors sitting in the control tower, propelling this jet fuel out to the rocket ship. Now the operators out on the rocket ship thinking through like, hey, like basically like a go up or blow up type of situation, like an Elon Musk, at the end of the day, like my whole life is ride or die on this rocket ship, right? Whether it be a Tesla, whether it be a SpaceX, whether it be an early stage startup, whether it be technically later as it goes on, but this rocket ship needs to go up, right? Investors like, hey, look, like you need more jet fuel, you need less. Hopefully we don't give you too much and you blow up. Hopefully we don't give you too little and you don't make it out there. The other side of it is, because Alice, I feel like your experience is super interesting because you went from the higher level banking to the control tower being an investor on the growth equity side of things. Then you went early stage investing as well, where it's like, hey, look, let's focus on like a smaller rocket ship, earlier stage. Let's start with that. Now you're in the rocket ship, right? When it comes to like the operating side of things, like, hey, look, like now I'm literally here. So as we get into this, and of course, you tell me how we're doing on time, let's discuss a little bit more of the transition to the earlier side of things. Because at TCV, larger checks, at Lazard, I'm sure even larger deals, right? And then keep moving down that spectrum. How was it on the earlier stage side of things? So at Atomic for a little bit, and then of course, just like early stage VC, I know there were a couple different plays there on your end. We'd love to understand that. And then we can discuss operating right after.
Yeah, I would say just to clarify, I think with Atomic and the primary experience, that was more on the operating side. So slightly less on the early stage VC, but I can also kind of talk about that a little bit. I think I do find the early stage super, super interesting. I think the types of things that you're looking at is different from what you would be looking at in terms of a growth equity lens. But I think when it comes to VC, a lot of it is about establishing relationships, understanding the management team, and using kind of thinking through the lens of like product market fit and understanding, does the team have like the skill sets and ability to execute? And I think that's very different than looking at a company that might have revenue numbers and might be making a profit and then analyzing the metrics that they have. And so I think definitely not ruling out investing as a long-term career, but I think what I felt for myself was that I wanted to see what it was like on the other side of the table, I felt like inherently the way my mind works and how I work, I'm probably built to be more of an operator. And so in order to be an investor, I think, at least for me, I had a hard time wrapping my mind around the fact that I was in my early 20s, didn't have any operating experience and was like trying to call the shots on whether or not this company was a good company to invest in or not. That being said, I don't think you need to be an operator to be a good investor. And I've seen many, many cases of people who've had really successful investing careers, never having done the operating side. But I think just for me and like what I was looking to do and what I needed, I felt like I needed to have the operating experience. And so that was also another factor that kind of moved me there beyond just kind of like the inherent desire and passion to build something.
100%. We have a lot of questions coming in, but side note, I 100% agree. When I said battery connecting with companies, there's that element of like, okay, like I'm literally connecting with this CEO and they've taken the call because of the battery.com domain, but like they have more experience doing ERP this, doing HCM that than I do literally years on this earth as like a 22-year-old. And I was just like, why am I discussing like, sure, like, and to be fair, like I could BS to a certain degree where it's like, hey, look, like long tail of competitors, let's roll them up, take on some growth capital, focus on the organic that you've been already doing so well at. Let's focus on the inorganic. But after some time, I was like, what are you talking about? Like Rohit, to a certain degree, it was like, look, like, do you want to get like your hands dirty and get an understanding of what it's like to scale a business? Because I was just like, when you get to the growth equity side of things, you're like, oh yeah, like 5 million ARR, like too small, like 80% gross margins. Nah, got to be like 95% plus. But it's like, when you get to the operating side, you're like, oh my God, if we had 5 million ARR, I'd be like literally the happiest person in the world. That's so difficult to get. So it's a totally different perspective. And I love the fact that of course, you've experienced that and you're seeing more of it because we have somewhat limited time here. So if you don't mind, we're going to get into a couple of these questions and we can kind of keep it going. Awesome. What does being an investor teach you about being an operator? What are key challenges that you've experienced?
I think the investing experience was really helpful, at least now as we're kind of, whether it's we're going into a fundraising process later in the year, or even just kind of thinking about the different like building blocks that we have to think through in building our company. I think having that investment framework and understanding what are people looking for, especially those who are giving you money, I think it was really helpful to have that experience. I would say, I think challenges, as with anything, is I didn't have a ton of operating experience before. So I think when you're an investor, sure, you're picking apart companies and you're diligencing them and you're trying to peel back all the layers to understand what's going on, but you're still not seeing like the day-to-day, like every nitty gritty part that goes into like creating something. Like, sure, you can look at a P&L and be like, oh, why can't you just cut your like cost by like X%? But like, in order to do that, that actually requires like getting rid of real people or real resources. And how does that have like resounding impact to the rest of your business? And so I think it's just differences in like how narrow of an experience you have. That being said, during my summer in my business school experience, I did intern for a digital health startup called Found, and really loved that experience. And I think that was a really great way for me to actually see kind of like the day-to-day of what's happening in a digital health company. And I think that kind of was able to help bridge some of the gaps that I had from my investor experience.
Awesome. And can we plug the startup? Can we get an understanding of kind of like the 30-second pitch?
Yeah, I'll talk about it at a high level, given that there's still some moving pieces that we're figuring out at the moment. But I would say high level is we're tackling the women's chronic care and complex condition space. And so this is anything from like autoimmune disorders, hormonal imbalances, digestive disorders, such as like PCOS, Crohn's, endometriosis, thyroid conditions. The idea here being women's chronic health is something that's both personal to me, but also a huge opportunity. Women's health in general is just very under researched and not well understood. And there's a lot of services out there for more like fertility and maternal focused care, but not ones that kind of span across an entire person's like health experience. And the idea being here that, even when we're looking at a condition such as like diabetes or heart conditions, different symptoms often present differently in women than with men. men. And a lot of research also shows that women tend to have higher rates of comorbidity. So essentially, we're looking to improve the type of care that women are receiving there. We're building a digital health tool that essentially unifies different touch points that women have with their providers. The idea being that when it comes to chronic health, there is comorbidities and they span across different organ systems. And so if you have like PCOS, for example, your health is super interconnected. There's the physical health, there's the mental health, there's the lifestyle considerations that all influence it. And right now our care is super, super fragmented across different providers, different touch points, different digital health systems. And so we're looking to kind of unify those insights and allow women to have a longitudinal timeline of their care.
Awesome. Very cool. HBS, would you do it again?
I would. It was a crazy experience and lots of highs and lows, but I think net at the end of the day, I'm so happy I went. I met a ton of incredible people, and they always talk about like the network, how important that is, but I don't think I truly understood the power of that network until even after I graduated and was working on the startup full time. I think to what I had mentioned earlier, there's so many things I don't know. The healthcare ecosystem is also super complex. There's so many different stakeholders. And so I'll just give you an example. Like a couple of weeks ago, we had a pitch and we were trying to refine our go-to-market strategy and understand how do we sell into like the payer channel. And like, sure, I've talked about this at a high level during my investor years and like understood at a high level, like what other digital health companies were doing, but didn't really understand like exactly what does that sales process look like? What are the exact numbers and metrics that payers are looking for? Like, how do I tie like our outcomes to cost savings and all of that? And what does like an estimate of like a contract, like what does that look like? And so I was able to just like ping a bunch of people, whether it's section mates or people in the healthcare club, and got just such quick feedback back. And I think having those conversations and being able to talk to people about it and pick their brains, it was just so useful in a way that I've never experienced before. And so I think it's a community where people are really willing to help and share their experiences. And I found that super helpful as we're building.
Huge. I mean, to a certain degree, would you say that the startup, well, I mean, maybe you met your co-founder in like a different capacity, right? But I would argue that, of course, like kind of you mentioned during first year that you met, and then of course, from there starts the business thereafter, right? I think that that's like a really big part of it.
Yeah. And it's both kind of the resources and then also meeting my co-founder. But I would say the other thing is starting something is can be pretty lonely. And that's a part that not a lot of people talk about. And I think even just having a support network of other people who are building and founding things, I think that has been incredibly useful as well. And just resource sharing there.
No, I mean, I kind of joke about this, but I feel like the large H stands for like humble. Honestly, with the individuals that we've interacted with, and we have a lot of coaches from kind of like GSV, Wharton, M7, HBS, the Harvard individuals that we've interacted with. A lot of our friends have gone there. A lot of our friends are actually going right now, first year, second years. And then of course, just a lot of them have come onto our platform on the webinar side of things, written articles, coached individuals, really like intrinsically like humble individuals. And I'm literally not saying that, right? Just for the sake of saying it, because you have these individuals being like, hey, look, like I know I was in like banking, growth equity, buyout, in business school, might go back. Like I know I'm good, right? Like I know my profile is good on paper, but the reality is that like I know a lot of people are good, to be fair, and like that itself like means a lot, right? Because it's like, hey, look, like you understand that like you are kind of like top tier, top echelon, just like a high performer. Let's just call it that, right? But when you go there, and like this is kind of like the interaction I've had with many of the individuals, they're like, yeah, like we understand that like we're lucky to be part of this group, but like there are a lot of us here, right? Which means that like there are a lot of people that have done really well to get here. So it's like part of it ends up being like, why have it be me against the other individual in class, whether it be a section mate, whether it be a classmate, because it's literally just us against the world. Like the world is super competitive these days, right? Like more than anything, arguably because of the internet and all of the progression that has come through it or the progress. So why add more competition? Like, let's like work with each other. Let's like work in tandem with each other and figure out like, hey, look, like us against the world type of mentality from a section mate perspective. And I've seen this when it comes to like discussing like arguably potentially like competitive businesses or even like search funds where they're like, yeah, like I'm looking for a business. Bunch of us are looking for businesses. And to be fair, like we all want to do well, right? And like just because someone else finds one doesn't mean that I won't find one. There's enough opportunity out there. But yeah, honestly, that's just kind of my take. But we've had a lot of success working with HBS individuals. So it's awesome to hear overall. And this carries a lot of weight too.
No, I mean, I'm glad you think that. But I would say on a more serious note, I think I also came in with this conception in my mind of, the stereotypes of HBS and what types of people go here, but honestly have been very, very pleasantly surprised by just how down to earth a lot of people are, how incredible some of the friendships that I made are. And I really actually didn't feel much of a competitive dynamic when it came to like academics or the work environment. That being said, I'm one person and this is maybe my perspective, but I think that at least from an academic perspective, people aren't trying to, screw each other over or do any of that stuff. Like I found it very, very collaborative. Even my first week, I didn't know how to do something for one of the assignments and someone was just like sat me down and walked me through it. And so you never know who you're going to cross paths with again and who can help you in the future. And so I think, generally I found that people tend to be pretty collaborative and are always willing to help out.
Nice. Awesome. How are you doing on time, by the way?
I got probably like 5 to 10 minutes.
Cool. Perfect. Okay. So these are majority of the questions I had. But let's open it up a little bit more and let's start answering a couple of these. And I know we spoke about a few of them, but can we discuss a little bit more day to day on the TCV side of things and what that looked like? Because I know sometimes questions end up being around like sourcing, what role that fits into investing as a whole, financial diligence. Is it only sourcing, eat what you kill? I know some firms are. Would love to learn more from you.
Yeah, I felt like my experience was actually a pretty healthy mix. I think it varies a little bit based on which sub team you're on as well, and also how that has like changed on the year. I think sometimes they try to push more sourcing, sometimes less. So I think it really depends. But I would say when I was there, I felt like it was a pretty good, somewhat even mix, maybe slightly skewed towards execution versus sourcing. I think on the sourcing side, a lot of times it would be both kind of my own initiatives, just like doing cold outreach, emailing people, setting up initial intro calls. But when it kind of gets past that intro stage, sometimes I was going to meetings with my manager, getting to know the management team, learning more about the company. Sometimes they would do kind of a more like formal pitch, send us their deck or walk us through that. And then when it kind of gets to that point where we're like, okay, you know what, this seems like a really interesting company. We really want to invest a little bit more time to kind of dig into it. Then we'll start putting together an investment memo. So usually that was like a deck or a really long document that kind of summarized what are the key investment theses that we had and some of the risks and considerations that we were thinking through, and then supporting graphs and pages to kind of back up both of those things. And so we would present that to our internal team, kind of get their feedback. Sometimes they would have additional questions, which we would bring back to the management team, work with them to figure out some of the answers, and then kind of send a revised draft of the memo. And eventually it goes to the investment committee, which is made up of our partners. And they would kind of make a final call on the decision. They would also have a more in-depth meeting or pitch from that management team to ultimately decide. So I would say that was kind of like the progression. And I think on any given day, I could be working on a mix of those things or one or the other. And it really, really depended on the day and what types of deals we were pursuing and how many deals I was on at the time.
Awesome. You brought up a really good point around building something, right? And kind of sometimes super daunting task, because at the end of the day, 0 to 1, I would argue, is much more difficult than kind of like a 1 to 10, even over time. And to be fair, you have more people sometimes in like a 1 to 10 situation than a 0 to 1, right? Because of limited resources. How do you stay motivated?
That's a really good question. I think it really helps that I'm working on something that I actually genuinely care about a ton. I think my personal story is that I've had my own healthcare experiences as a teenager growing up, and so very familiar with like the autoimmune chronic care space.
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the drive to be building something is to improve both quality and access to care for women who maybe were in my shoes 5, 10, 15 years ago. And so I think a lot of it is just personal drive and really wanting to see a change in the industry. And I think that motivates me, but I think I also feel very, very lucky. But in that I have an amazing team and co-founder and people that I'm working with. And I think even though I think it was very lucky that we met each other, I think it's also very intentional for us to be surrounding ourselves with people that we value and respect and share similar kind of personal ethos. And so I think just being able to be surrounded by people that I feel good around has also been really helpful, even when times are tough.
Totally. No, I think being passionate, and no, it sounds like a cliche and do what you like and all this other jazz. But to be fair, like, yes, like a big proponent of like actually do what you like, because it won't feel like work. Part of the reason we started the office hours was like really just like build out a network. We were like, we know so many people in the space. And to be fair, like COVID allows individuals not to necessarily have like in-person coffee chats. What should we do with this network to a certain degree? And how can we help out others? And sure, like we have like paid mentees, we have unpaid mentees, we just have a lot of people we interact with. And overall, like the broader thesis, I look at it as like basically like leveling up the industry and helping individuals to learn more. It doesn't necessarily mean breaking into banking or buy side. Real intrinsic goal is figure out what you want to do sooner than later. There's so much noise in the world. And to be fair, like if you want to start your own thing, like does it mean go to YC? Does it mean like start off there? Does it mean like, get some like tangible experience and then go from there? Maybe, but the more people that you have conversations with, kind of like targeted conversations in a coaching capacity will allow you to learn that. So big proponent of that.
Yeah, totally. And I think the other thing is just maybe knowing what your like North Star is as well. I think for us, there was kind of a few different areas within women's health that we really cared about, or a few problem spaces that we really cared about addressing, which is kind of like the interconnectivity of the health and how traditional healthcare system oftentimes treats like the symptoms rather than the underlying root causes. And there's a ton of fragmentation. I think those were the pieces that we've really, really narrowed in on as kind of being the problem spaces or the North Star that we want to try and solve. That being said, what the startup actually does has evolved like so much over time since we first met and when we first started. And the solution is not necessarily something we're tied to. So I think that it helps to be grounded in something that you care about or you can treat as kind of this internal compass, but knowing that it's going to change a ton and there's going to be ups and downs, and that's a totally normal part of the process.
Yeah, I think life is full of pivots. Last question, and really appreciate the time. More in kind of like the light of like office hours and of course coming on as a coach, time dependent and all this good stuff, and really appreciate you doing this. What sort of advice would you give to juniors that are thinking through this? One question was effectively like a lot of my previous classes basically given up on banking. It's a lot of pressure. It's a lot of stress. It's a lot of like, hey, like, do you really know what you want to get into? Honestly, what advice would you give to 10 years ago, Alice?
Yeah, I mean, I know it's easier said than done, but I think I wouldn't put so much pressure on yourself to like have to do what you think you should be doing. But maybe really take the time to reflect and like, what are the things that you like? Like, where do you find yourself drawn to? And this is such a lame example, but like, for example, if I am really good at like making to-do lists or staying organized, like what does that skill set mean in terms of types of jobs that I could be really, really good at? Like, how does that skill set translate into something that's very actionable? Or even, I think like, as we had talked about like many times now, I think the importance of just staying open-minded and recognizing that life doesn't always go according to plan. I think even for me, it wasn't like I knew I wanted to invest in banking. I figured that out over time, thinking about what do I like, what do I not like. I didn't know I wanted to go into growth equity from the get-go, but that was something I figured out over time talking to people as well. And even the entrepreneurship stuff, that was something that became much more clear in the last couple of years. But I will say, like, you asked this question earlier, and I don't think I answered it, which is like, did I always know I want to be a founder? Like, I definitely didn't, but there were telltale signs that I did. Even it's like getting involved in the entrepreneurship ecosystem when I was in college. Like, I didn't found something, but I think I was very, very motivated and energized by that type of community. Before I started business school, I'd always been really, really interested in photography. And before business school, I started my freelance photography business. And so that was, it's not a venture-backed startup, but I think there was just so many things that were similar about creating something, having that full control and autonomy and being able to set something up myself and be creative with it, and really follow that personal passion that actually was very translatable to starting, a startup on my own. And so I think when you look out for the signs of like, what are the things that really energize you and what are the things that you feel like you're really, really good at, when you can kind of find that intersection of like what you love, but also good at is super, super important. And you don't have to have all the answers from the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you so much. It'll take time. I think that would just be like my one thing, and kind of like the culminating fact that all of this will take time. And to be fair, like sometimes we're like so caught up what we do in like a day's time, a week, a month, but we don't think about like a year or like 10 years and what that looks like. But yeah, I mean, looking back, like 21-year-old Rohit like didn't know anything. 31-year-old Rohit I think still doesn't know much. But to be fair, it's still like getting an understanding of like, hey, it'll come with time. And the more you do something, the better you get at it. That's why like senior partners and investors can like literally walk into the room and just like know their way around a deal or a memo that quickly. But that comes with experience. There's no hack. Like the 10,000 hour rule really exists. But Alice, immensely helpful.
Yeah. I would just say one more thing. I think like in addition to being in tune with yourself and recognizing like the positive feelings of when you're doing something you love, I think also actually recognizing feeling like potentially negative feelings too. I mean, I don't want to say negative because it sounds so harsh, but I think even towards my like last year of banking, and maybe I wasn't feeling like I was growing anymore. I was itching for something different. I didn't know what that different was, but I knew that there was kind of this feeling within me that like I needed to transition or pivot. So I think when you listen to yourself to kind of recognize those moments as well, that also is like a light bulb moment of like, okay, maybe my time here is done and it's time to move on to something else. But yeah, I would just say listen to yourself and kind of be intuitive about it.
Totally. Awesome. Thank you so much. I look forward to turning this into like digestible formats for others to engage too. But we had like over 50 people join, which is great. So I'm sure many people found it helpful. And thanks again. And we'll let you get back to it.
Well, thank you so much. It was really great chatting with you.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone that joined. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.